There is a version of Canada that nobody shows you. Not the Canada of the history books, where explorers arrived on shores and planted flags and drew borders across maps that had been in use by other people for 10,000 years. And not the Canada of the tourist brochures, where the mountains are purple in the distance and the lakes are so perfectly still they look like mirrors laid face up on the earth. This is the Canada that exists beneath your feet, beneath every city, beneath every street, beneath every building that was built and rebuilt and built again on top of what came before it, beneath the parking garages and the subway platforms and the utility tunnels and the deep foundations of the glass towers. Beneath all of that, at a depth that most people will never reach, a different world has been sealed away. 15 meters below the surface of Montreal, the ground holds the remains of a city that existed long before anyone European had ever heard of this place. Long before the first French ships crossed the Atlantic and navigated the great river westward into the interior of a continent they had never imagined. A city that stood here, on the slopes of the mountain, and received European visitors, and then quietly ceased to be, and whose physical remains, compressed and fragmented and preserved in the particular way that dark soil preserves things, are still there today. Still there, beneath the university lawns and the student housing and the cafes and the streets. 15 meters below Toronto, a buried river still runs through channels that were sealed and forgotten more than a century ago. Not metaphorically buried, literally buried, enclosed in a brick-lined tunnel by engineers who needed the land above it for other purposes, and who understood, or at least believed, that a city was worth more than the creek that had run through it since the glaciers retreated. 15 meters below Ottawa, there are rooms that were built to survive a nuclear war, rooms stocked with food and water and communications equipment, and the administrative infrastructure of a government that intended, if necessary, to continue governing from underground after the surface of the country had been destroyed. Rooms connected to a network of tunnels and facilities that extends, in ways that the government of Canada has never fully disclosed, across the national capital region and beyond. And 15 meters below Vancouver, the original landscape of the Pacific coast, the ancient forests and the tidal flats, and the shell middens of people who lived there for 10,000 years before anyone else arrived, is still there. Sealed beneath concrete and glass and the weight of a modern city that was built, for most of its history, without asking what it was being built on top of. This documentary is about that depth, 15 meters. It sounds like an ordinary number, a construction specification, a measurement on a blueprint somewhere in a city engineer's office. But 15 meters is also a threshold. It is the point at which the modern world gives way to everything that came before it. The point at which the sewers become old sewers, and then older sewers, and then something that is not a sewer at all, but a buried stream that predates the city by thousands of years. The point at which the foundations of one building give way to the foundations of another building, and then to bare earth, and then to hearths and middens, and the discarded tools of people who lived here when Canada was not a country, not a colony, not even a concept in the minds of the people who would eventually create it. Nobody talks about this, not in any sustained or serious way. There are occasional news stories when construction workers find something they did not expect. There are academic papers and journals that most people will never encounter. There are plaques on buildings in certain neighborhoods, brief bronze sentences that gesture at depths below without ever really describing what is down there. But the full picture, the one that shows every Canadian city as a kind of vertical archive, layered with centuries and millennia of history, compressed into the ground beneath your feet like pressed flowers in a very old book. that picture has never quite been assembled in one place. This is our attempt to assemble it. Before we go underground, it helps to understand what underground actually means in the context of a Canadian city. When geologists and archaeologists talk about the subsurface of an urban area, they are describing a world of compressed time. Think of it like a layer cake, except that each layer does not represent a few hours of baking. Each layer represents decades, or centuries, or in some cases, millennia. Each layer was laid down by the activities of a different generation of people, and then buried under the activities of the next. In most Canadian cities, the top 2 or 3 meters are what engineers call fill. This is the material that was added during urban development, gravel and concrete rubble and imported soil, sometimes mixed with the demolition debris of buildings that no longer exist. This fill layer is relatively recent. In most cities, it dates to the 20th century, sometimes the late 19th. Below it, you encounter the original ground surface, the soil that existed when European settlers first arrived, shaped by the activities of the people who were already here. Deeper still, you move into the archaeological record. In cities like Montreal and Winnipeg and Victoria, where indigenous populations had been living for thousands of years before contact, this layer can contain extraordinary things. Stone tools, bone fragments, the charcoal traces of ancient fires, the compacted floors of longhouses and wigwams and storage pits, the faint outlines, visible only to trained eyes in exactly the right conditions, of structures that stood here before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. And at around 15 meters, in most Canadian cities, you reach the boundary of the most active and most significant archaeological investigation. Below that depth, the soil changes. It becomes more compressed, more disturbed by geological forces, less likely to yield the kind of organized material that archaeologists are looking for in their search for evidence of human behavior. 15 meters is also, roughly, the depth at which the cities of the 20th century were most aggressively and most consequentially built. Subway lines, deep foundation columns, underground parking garages. The infrastructure of modern urban life was driven into the earth at that depth, and in doing so, it sealed everything above it from everything below. 15 meters is not a coincidence. It is the distance at which the modern city and the ancient city become strangers to each other. Two worlds, separated by soil and silence and the accumulated weight of time, occupying the same coordinates on a map, but entirely different coordinates in history. This is the geography we are going to explore. We begin in Montreal, because Montreal, more than almost any other Canadian city, is a place where the past refuses to stay buried. It surfaces in unexpected ways, through cracks in the pavement on the plateau, where you can sometimes see brick courses that do not match anything above them, through basements in the old city that reveal themselves, when you look carefully enough, to be far older than the buildings above them, their stone laid in a manner that predates the city's formal history. Through tunnels that appear on no official map and lead, according to the urban explorers who have followed them, to chambers that have not been opened in decades, their purpose ambiguous, their origin uncertain. But even old Montreal, with its cobblestones and its gray stone walls, and its sense of being a European city somehow transplanted whole to the banks of the St. Lawrence, is a relatively recent surface layer. Beneath its streets lies a city that preceded it by centuries. Beneath that city lies another, and below all of them, in the sediment that was laid down when the glacier that covered this part of North America began its final retreat, there is evidence of the first human beings who ever walked on this ground. In 1535, the French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River and encountered a large and well-organized village on the slopes of the mountain that would later be called Montreal. The village was called Hochelaga by its Mohawk inhabitants, and by Cartier's account, it was a substantial settlement, a palisaded town of 50 large longhouses, each capable of housing multiple families, surrounded by cultivated fields of corn and beans and squash. Cartier estimated a population of around 1,000 people, though historians believe the actual figure may have been considerably higher. Consider what that means for a moment. 1,000 people, living in a community complex enough to require the construction and maintenance of large communal buildings, practicing agriculture sophisticated enough to sustain that population through the long northern winters, maintaining social and political structures complex enough to negotiate with foreign visitors with apparent confidence and ease. This was not a temporary camp or a seasonal gathering place. This was a city, in every sense that matters. Cartier spent a single day at Hochelaga. He climbed the mountain, looked out over the river, was treated with hospitality by a people who had absolutely no reason to know yet what Europeans would eventually bring to this continent. He described what he saw in terms that convey, even through the centuries and the translation, his genuine amazement. And then he left. When Samuel de Champlain arrived in the same region 72 years later, in 1607, Hochelaga was gone. Not destroyed in any obvious physical sense, simply absent. The site where 1,000 people had lived was empty, returning to forest. No one who came after Cartier ever satisfactorily explained what happened to the village and its people. The Mohawk themselves had moved, as nations moved, following the complex political geography of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy through the years of epidemic and conflict that reshaped northeastern North America in the late 16th century. The site of Hochelaga, most archaeological evidence suggests, lies beneath what is now McGill University, beneath the lawns of the Arts Building, beneath the foundations of the Red Path Museum, beneath the paths that students walk every day between lectures and libraries and cafes. The students step on the same ground where, 5 centuries ago, children ran between longhouses, and women tended their gardens, and men returned from trading journeys, carrying goods from hundreds of kilometers away. In 1860, construction workers building a new building on the McGill campus uncovered a large number of indigenous artifacts: tools of stone and bone, pottery fragments, the charred remnants of what appeared to be structural material from longhouse walls. The discovery made news briefly, and then it was largely forgotten, built over and built on, the artifacts removed to collections, where they sat in storage for generations, available to researchers who knew to ask for them, invisible to everyone else. In subsequent decades, other discoveries were made in the same general area. Each time, the pattern was the same: discovery, brief attention, documentation at varying levels of thoroughness depending on the resources and the timeline available, and then burial. As the new construction proceeded and the ground was sealed again, the full extent of what lies beneath the McGill campus has never been comprehensively excavated. It may never be. The university is a working institution of 60,000 students, not an archaeological park. The buildings are not going to be dismantled to find out what is underneath them. And so, Hochelaga, one of the largest pre-contact settlements in what is now Canada, the village that hosted the first recorded encounter between European explorers and the Haudenosaunee people of the St. Lawrence Valley, remains sealed beneath a campus where most students will complete 4 years of study without ever learning that the ground beneath their feet was once a town. This is the pattern that will repeat throughout this documentary. Something is found, it is noted, sometimes briefly celebrated, sometimes studied, and then it is forgotten. Not through deliberate conspiracy, not through any coordinated act of suppression, but through something quieter and more pervasive, through the ordinary indifference of a society that is more focused on the construction of its future than on the excavation of its past. Montreal has an underground city. Most people who have visited or who have heard much about the place know this. It is called the RESO, a network of tunnels and pedestrian pathways that connect more than 60 shopping centers, 10 metro stations, 2 bus terminals, 2 universities, hotels, cinemas, offices, and residential buildings across the downtown core. The RESO stretches for more than 33 kilometers and is used by approximately 500,000 people every day. It was built, largely, between the 1960s and the 1980s, a product of Montreal's remarkable ambition in the years following the 1967 World's Fair. In a city where winters regularly push temperatures to 30 below zero, the idea of a climate-controlled underground pathway network was genuinely radical. It changed how people moved through the city. It made the underground not a place to avoid, but a place to inhabit. But the RESO was not the first underground network in Montreal, and it was not built into empty ground. When the tunnels of the Montreal Metro were being excavated in the early 1960s, workers encountered, on multiple occasions, the remains of an older underground world. Stone-lined chambers that appeared to be root cellars or storage rooms from the 18th century, the remnants of the original French colonial fortifications, the walls and ditches and earthworks that had once defined the perimeter of the city and that had stood here through decades of conflict, and were then, when the city outgrew them, simply buried under the expansion. And, at greater depth, material that archaeologists date to pre-contact periods, worked bone, ceramic fragments, stone tools that show the characteristic napping marks of the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples who used this stretch of the St. Lawrence Valley for at least 4,000 years before any European ever saw it. Much of this material was recovered. Some of it was studied. Some of it is in the collection of the Pointe-à-Calier Museum, Montreal's remarkable archaeology museum, which sits at the very spot where the city was founded in 1642, and which is, essentially, a museum built directly on top of an active archaeological site, with viewing platforms that allow visitors to look down into the excavated remains below. You can stand in that museum and see, beneath your feet, the original foundations of the city, the first walls, the first street, the physical bones of the earliest European settlement on the island. But the metro tunnels were not waiting for archaeologists. They were waiting for trains. The schedule was the schedule, the budget was the budget, and much of what was found during the metro's construction was set aside, or, in some cases, destroyed as the tunnels moved forward through the earth. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people ride the Montreal Metro through tunnels that pass within meters of the sealed-off remains of a city that preceded it by centuries. The trains run on schedule. The passengers read their phones and listen to their music and think about their appointments. And 15 meters above them, and 15 meters to the side, and sealed behind the concrete walls of the tunnels, the buried world continues to be buried. Now we move west, to Toronto. And in Toronto, the thing that is buried is not just a village, It is the entire landscape. Toronto sits at the western end of Lake Ontario, on a plain that was, in the geologically recent past, the floor of a glacial lake. When the ice sheets retreated from this region approximately 12,000 years ago, they left behind not just the Great Lakes, but a series of smaller, shallower lakes that took centuries to drain and settle into their current configurations. The land that is now downtown Toronto was, at various points in its post-glacial history, underwater, or waterlogged, or carved through by streams and rivers that ran down from the escarpment to the north and drained into the lake in braided channels across a broad, flat plain. Before European settlement, this landscape was defined by water. The Don River entered Lake Ontario through a wide and marshy estuary, its mouth spreading into a delta of channels and wetlands rich with fish and waterfowl. The Humber River, to the west, was broader and slower than it is today, its lower reaches spreading across the plain before meeting the lake. Between them, a series of smaller streams crossed the landscape, draining the slopes of the escarpment, creating pockets of wetland and forest that sheltered an abundance of wildlife that early European accounts describe with something approaching disbelief. And within this landscape, people had been living for thousands of years. The community of Baby Point, in what is now West Toronto, occupies a bluff above the Humber River that was, in the late 17th century, the site of Teiagan, a Seneca village and trading center that was one of the most strategically important indigenous settlements in the Great Lakes region. Teiagan occupied a key point on the Toronto Passage, a north-south trade route that connected the St. Lawrence Valley to the upper Great Lakes via a series of rivers and overland portages. This was not a minor local path. It was a major continental trade corridor, used by people moving goods and ideas across distances that most Canadians today would consider extraordinary. The village at Teiagan was known to European traders from the 1660s onward. French missionaries visited it and wrote about it. Fur traders used it as a resupply and negotiation point. It appears on some of the earliest maps of the region, marked as a place of significance. And yet most Torontonians today have never heard of Teiagan, and the neighborhood of Baby Point, which sits directly on its former location, is known primarily as a pleasant enclave of large houses and ravine trails, with no indication that the ground beneath it once supported a significant community. Below Baby Point, at the 15-meter depth, there are archaeological deposits associated with Teiagan, and with the long sequence of indigenous occupation that preceded it. The Humber River Valley has been a place of human activity since the earliest post-glacial period, and the sediment of its banks has accumulated the material evidence of all that activity over thousands of years. But there is something even older and even more thoroughly buried that deserves particular attention. Something that was not a village at all, but a feature of the natural landscape that was so important to the human communities of the region that its burial, when it came, represented something close to the erasure of a world. Tattle Creek. Tattle Creek was once one of the defining features of the landscape that would become Toronto. It rose in the hills north of the city and flowed south and east, carving a broad, shallow valley through what is now the University of Toronto campus and the neighborhood of the Annex. It was not a large stream by any objective measure. At its widest, it was perhaps 20 meters across, and in summer it could be shallow enough to wade. But it was permanent, it was clean, and it flowed through a valley that the indigenous people of the region had used as a travel corridor and living space for thousands of years. The University of Toronto, which was established on the western bank of Tattle Creek in the 1850s, effectively ended the creek's open existence. First it was dammed, to create a decorative pond on the university grounds. Then, as the university expanded and the neighborhood grew, it was enclosed in a culvert. By 1884, Tattle Creek had essentially ceased to exist as a visible feature of the landscape. It still flowed, in its brick-lined pipe, beneath the streets of the annex and the university campus. But you could no longer see it, or hear it, or know from the surface of the city that it was there. Beneath the university's Hart House and the buildings of the Faculty of Law, beneath the streets of the annex neighborhood where families park their cars and take their dogs for walks on weekday evenings, Tattle Creek is still flowing. And in the sediment that has accumulated in its valley over the past 10,000 years, there is archaeological material that has never been systematically investigated. The material of the people who camped and fished and gathered along its banks across the entirety of the post-glacial period. Toronto has lost, by this kind of burial and culverting, more than 30 significant watercourses. Garrison Creek, which once wound through the west end and emptied into the lake near the present location of Coronation Park. Castle Frank Brook, which flowed through the ravines of the Rosedale neighborhood before being enclosed in a pipe beneath the streets. Mud Creek, whose name alone speaks to what its fate was always likely to be. These streams are all still underground. They all still flow, reduced and constrained, through pipes and culverts beneath streets that their burial made possible. The burial of these watercourses was not only an environmental event, it was an archaeological one. Rivers are where people lived. Rivers are where the evidence of human occupation concentrates over time because people return to good water sources generation after generation, and each generation leaves behind a layer of material in the sediment. When you bury a river, you seal the entire archaeological record of everyone who ever lived beside it. And in the Toronto area, the people who lived beside those rivers, for most of the period that humans have been present here, were the ancestors of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe Nation, who were the primary inhabitants of the Toronto region at the time of European contact. Their villages and camps and gathering places and burial grounds are in that sealed sediment, in the dark, beneath the streets of a city that was built, in many cases, without any systematic effort to understand what was already there. There is a second story about Toronto that needs to be told. Not about what is under the residential neighborhoods, but about what is under the waterfront. The shoreline of Lake Ontario in Toronto has moved, over the past 2 centuries, approximately 500 meters to the south. The land between the original shoreline, roughly where Front Street runs today, and the current waterfront is entirely fill. It was created from the rubble of demolished buildings, from the dredge material of harbor improvements, from deliberate dumping programs that extended through most of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Beneath the harbor front, beneath the Rogers Center, beneath the CN Tower, there is no original ground. There is compressed rubble and fill material and the compacted remains of a landscape that was systematically extended to make room for port facilities that were themselves eventually demolished to make room for the city that exists today. And beneath the fill, beneath the rubble of those demolished buildings and the dredge material and the compressed shore, there is the original lake bed, the original shoreline, the tidal wetlands where the Don River met the lake and where, for thousands of years, the people of this region harvested fish and waterfowl and the biological richness of the interface between land and water. That original shore is not 15 meters below the surface. In some places along the waterfront, it is 30 meters down, buried under 2 centuries of deliberate infilling. And what was on that original shore? The evidence of human habitation going back to the earliest post-glacial period is now so compressed and so inaccessible that it will almost certainly never be systematically investigated. The cities keep growing. The layers keep getting buried deeper. And the story of what lies beneath them continues largely untold. When archaeologists do get the opportunity to investigate in Toronto, what they find is frequently remarkable. The construction of the Spadina subway extension, completed in 2017, encountered archaeological deposits at multiple locations along its route. The new stations required deep excavation through parts of the city that had never been substantially disturbed, and the archaeologists who were employed to monitor the construction documented dozens of features, including evidence of pre-contact indigenous occupation at several locations along the alignment. The excavation for the new courthouse on Armory Street in the 1990s encountered what was described at the time as one of the most significant archaeological assemblages ever found in downtown Toronto. The site yielded thousands of artifacts from multiple periods of occupation, including indigenous artifacts that predated European settlement by several centuries. The excavation was conducted under significant time pressure because the construction timeline was not adjusted to accommodate the finds, and archaeologists were left to work as quickly as they could before the foundation was poured. This is the pattern. The archaeology is found. It is documented, with varying degrees of thoroughness depending on the time and resources available. And then, it is covered over again, buried beneath the new building, returned to the darkness. There is a reason that Torontonians, walking the streets of their city, have so little sense of the depth of its history. The history is not visible. It is underground, where they cannot see it. The city of Winnipeg, situated at the junction of the Red River and the Assiniboine River on the southern Manitoba Plain, understands its buried past in a way that most Canadian cities do not. Or rather, it has been forced to confront that past in a way that most Canadian cities have been able to avoid. In 1987, construction work for the redevelopment of the Forks, the green space at the confluence of the two rivers that had been the site of railway yards for most of the 20th century, uncovered an archaeological record of extraordinary richness. At the bottom of the sequence, at the deepest levels, were the traces of the earliest occupants of this place. People who came to the Forks when the prairie grassland was just establishing itself after the retreat of the glaciers, when the rivers were running high with glacial meltwater, when the land was still finding its shape after the departure of the ice. These people left behind stone tools of a distinctive type, notched spear points and scrapers and knives that indicate they were hunters of large game, pursuing the bison herds that were beginning to establish themselves across the emerging prairie landscape. Above that layer were others, each representing a different cultural period, each adding its contribution to the accumulating record of human life at this confluence. The prairie woodland period, characterized by the use of pottery and a more diverse subsistence strategy that made use not only of bison, but of fish and plant foods, and the small mammals of the riparian environment. The early and late plains periods, during which the ceremonial life of the prairie peoples became more elaborate, and the networks of trade and interaction that used the Forks as a node expanded across the entire Great Plains, linking communities from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Lakes. And running through all of these layers, consistent and continuous across 6,000 years, the evidence of the rivers, the fish bones, the waterfowl remains, the plant material from the riparian zone. 6,000 years of people coming to this place because the place was good. The excavation at the Forks was conducted under real-time pressure, as archaeological excavations in urban development contexts almost always are. The redevelopment was going ahead. The archaeologists had a window. They worked as thoroughly as they could within the constraints they were given. The full archaeological report from the Forks redevelopment runs to thousands of pages. It is a remarkable document, a record of 6,000 years of human activity, assembled in fragments under difficult conditions, by people working against the clock. The Forks is now a public space with an archaeological interpretive center. You can walk the grounds and see markers indicating where significant finds were made. You can visit the exhibits and see the artifacts. This is a genuine achievement. But it is also only the Forks. It is a single site within a city that spreads for many kilometers in every direction. Beyond the boundaries of the Forks National Historic Site, the archaeological record of Winnipeg is largely unacknowledged. The city of Winnipeg sits within the traditional territories of multiple First Nations, including the Anishinaabe peoples of the Lake Winnipeg Basin, the Dakota and Lakota peoples of the Red River Corridor, and the Métis people, whose communities grew up in the Red River settlement beginning in the late 18th century. The history of all of these peoples is embedded in the landscape of the city and its surroundings. Beneath the residential streets of the city's older neighborhoods, beneath the commercial strips and the railway corridors, there are archaeological sites that have never been formally investigated. Stone tool scatters, campsite remnants, the evidence of people moving through the landscape, stopping at good places, leaving behind the material of their passage. The Forks is, in this context, an exception that makes visible the rule. The exception is that here, at this one carefully demarcated location, the pre-contact history of the landscape was taken seriously and preserved and made part of the public story of the city. The rule is that everywhere else it was not. On the other side of the country, in Vancouver, the buried world takes a different form, and the story of its burial is, in certain ways, the starkest and most consequential version of the story we have been telling. Vancouver is a young city by Canadian standards. It was incorporated in 1886, barely 140 years ago. The original settlement on the south shore of Burrard Inlet is a relatively recent intrusion onto a landscape that had been occupied and shaped by human beings for at least 10,000 years. In geological terms, 140 years is not even a unit of time worth discussing. It is a moment. But the people who occupied this landscape before the city arrived, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, whose traditional territories encompass the area where Vancouver now stands, had been here for a very long time indeed. Archaeologists believe that the lower mainland of British Columbia, prior to European contact, had one of the highest population densities of any region in what is now Canada. The reason for this was simple and logical. The coastal environment here is extraordinarily productive. The rivers that drain into the Salish Sea carry enormous runs of salmon every year. The intertidal zones produce shellfish in staggering quantities. The forests provide materials for construction and tools and medicine. The climate, moderated by the Pacific, is less severe than almost anywhere else on the Canadian mainland. This was, and is, a place that could support a large and comfortable human population. And it did. The particular story of Vancouver's buried landscape is, in many ways, the story of False Creek. False Creek, as it exists today, is a modest urban waterway encircled by condominiums and the facilities that were built for the 1986 World's Fair. It is pleasant and much used, with a seawall walking path and a small passenger ferry service. It is, in its current form, about 1/3 of a kilometer wide at most points, and a few kilometers long. In its original form, False Creek was enormous. The original False Creek was a tidal inlet that extended approximately 4 kilometers inland from its mouth at the north shore of the delta, with extensive mudflats and salt marshes on either side that expanded and contracted with the tidal cycle. At low tide, the mudflats were exposed for a width of several hundred meters on each side, rich with clams and mussels and the other shellfish that sustain so much of the coastal ecology of the Pacific Northwest. At high tide, the inlet was navigable by canoe throughout most of its length. The indigenous communities of the area used False Creek as a fishing ground, a travel corridor, and a place of seasonal occupation spanning thousands of years. The mudflats produced enormous quantities of shellfish. The channels attracted salmon and herring and other fish. The margins of the inlet were rich with plant foods and materials that sustained daily life. Beneath the current floor of False Creek, and beneath the shores and streets that were built as the inlet was progressively filled in through the 20th century, there are deep deposits of shell-midden material. The accumulated debris of centuries of shellfish harvesting, the charcoal of ancient fires, the remains of tools and implements, the evidence of a community of people who returned to this waterway year after year, generation after generation, for a very long time. These deposits are buried under the fill material that was used to reclaim the land as Vancouver grew. They are under the parking lots and the condominiums and the roads and the park pathways that define the False Creek of today. Archaeologists know they are there. The Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples know they are there. The city of Vancouver knows they are there. There is a neighborhood in Vancouver called Marpole in the southern part of the city, where the story of the buried landscape takes on a particular character. The Marpole Midden, as archaeologists came to know it, was one of the largest and richest pre-contact archaeological sites ever documented on the northwest coast. It covered an area of approximately 30,000 square meters, and in some places was 3 meters deep. It dated back approximately 4,500 years and contained an extraordinary range of material, including carved bone and antler objects, copper ornaments traded from sources hundreds of kilometers away, and the remains of elaborate ceremonial activities that speak to a complex and sophisticated community life. The Marpole Midden was discovered and largely destroyed between 1880 and 1910. The land was being developed for residential use, and the midden was in the way. Collectors descended on the site and removed thousands of artifacts, many of which ended up in museums and private collections in Europe and the United States and across Canada. Professional archaeologists conducted what were called salvage excavations, recovering as much material as they could under the circumstances. And then the houses were built, and the surface of the midden was gone. But it is not entirely gone. The portions that were not excavated, the portions that lay beneath the area that was built upon before anyone thought to investigate, remain in place. They are under the houses and the streets and the gardens of a quiet residential neighborhood. They are at the 15-meter depth in some places, compressed and sealed, their contents intact. The Musqueam people, whose ancestors created the Marpole Midden over 4,000 years of occupation, have never forgotten it. They remember it not as an archaeological concept, but as a place where their relatives are buried. Human remains were recovered from the midden during the excavations of the early 20th century. More human remains have been encountered in subsequent decades, as redevelopment has continued in the neighborhood. Each encounter has required negotiation between the development interests and the Musqueam Nation, with results that have not always satisfied anyone. The question of who has the right to determine the fate of ancestral remains found during urban construction is not a simple one. It is a legal and cultural and spiritual question of considerable complexity. But the Musqueam perspective is clear and consistent. Those remains belong to Musqueam. The land beneath Marpole, which was once a place of great significance and activity and life for their community, is still Musqueam land in a meaningful sense, regardless of what has been built on it. And what is found beneath it deserves to be treated with respect appropriate to what it is, not with the urgency appropriate to a construction schedule. This perspective is being heard more clearly in Vancouver than it was 50 years ago. The three host nations have become increasingly assertive in their engagement with development projects that might affect the buried heritage of their traditional territories, and the legal and political framework has shifted, slowly but meaningfully, in a direction that supports that assertiveness. But the development continues, and the buried world continues to be disturbed. Now we need to talk about the government. Not in the way that phrase usually precedes something dramatic and conspiratorial. We are not going to tell you that there is a hidden government installation beneath the streets of Ottawa where shadowy officials conduct classified operations involving things that cannot be named. That is not this story. What we are going to tell you is that there is, in fact, a government installation beneath the landscape near Ottawa, and that it is not particularly secret, and that the story of why it was built and how it came to exist and what it was supposed to do is one of the stranger and more quietly disturbing chapters in recent Canadian history. In the village of Carp, Ontario, approximately 35 kilometers west of Ottawa, there is a 4-story building buried in the ground. It is called the Diefenbunker, named after the Prime Minister, John Diefenbunker, who authorized its construction in 1959. It was completed in 1961 at a cost of approximately $22 million, which is well over $200 million in today's currency, and it was designed for a single purpose: to house the Canadian government in the event of a nuclear attack on Ottawa and on the country. The facility is 4 stories deep, with each floor larger than the one above it, creating an inverted pyramid shape that helps distribute the load of the earth above. The deepest floor is about 15 meters below the surface. It contains a filtered air system designed to exclude radioactive particles from outside. It contains a blast tunnel, a long, angled entrance passage designed to absorb and redirect the pressure wave from a nearby nuclear detonation without destroying the structure behind it. It contains accommodation for up to 500 government officials, military personnel, and support staff, who were intended to be able to live and operate from this facility for up to 30 days after a nuclear strike. 30 days. That is how long the planners believed the government would need to manage the aftermath of a nuclear attack on Canada before it would be, in some sense, safe to return to the surface. 30 days in a buried building, running a country that might no longer exist in any recognizable form, managing a population that would have experienced something beyond any historical precedent, and doing so from a set of offices and conference rooms and dormitories dug into the Canadian Shield. The Diefenbunker was one of approximately 50 emergency relocation facilities built across Canada during the Cold War, at various levels of government and military priority. Not all of them were as substantial as the Carp facility. Some were little more than reinforced basements, with several weeks of supplies and a radio transmitter. Some were sophisticated communications facilities, designed to maintain contact with Allied command structures across the Atlantic. Some were facilities intended to allow the Bank of Canada to continue financial operations in the post-nuclear environment, because whoever was planning these things apparently believed that even in the aftermath of nuclear war, there would be important economic decisions to make. The Diefenbunker is now a museum. You can buy a ticket, walk its corridors, sit at the desk in the Prime Minister's suite, and try, if you allow yourself to really engage with it, to understand what it meant that this place existed. To understand that the people who built it were not treating the nuclear threat as an abstract diplomatic concept. They were building for a specific event, a specific catastrophe, and they were building seriously, with the full resources of a federal government that had decided this was worth doing. What the Diefenbunker's museum tour does not cover in comprehensive detail, and what is considerably less publicly available than the story of the Carp facility itself, is the full extent of the Cold War underground infrastructure across Canada more broadly. The Diefenbunker was a flagship facility. Its existence has been publicly acknowledged for decades. But the other facilities in the national network were not all decommissioned on the same timeline or with the same transparency. Some were quietly maintained into the 1990s. Some were repurposed for other uses, and their original function gradually written out of their institutional memory. Some remain, in a form that the Government of Canada does not advertise, in a state of low-level operational readiness. There are researchers, mostly amateur historians and Cold War historians, who have spent years attempting to map the full extent of Canada's underground Cold War infrastructure. They work from access to information requests and declassified documents and the accounts of engineers and contractors who worked on the facilities decades ago, and from the physical landscape itself, looking for the telling signs of buried infrastructure. The ventilation stacks that emerge from fields and parking lots in locations that make no obvious sense. The reinforced entrance buildings that are more solid and more substantial than their apparent purpose would require. The subtle changes in topography that indicate ground was moved in significant quantities and then carefully covered. What these researchers have assembled, piece by piece, over many years, is a picture of a country that spent 2 decades driving infrastructure into the ground at significant depth across its major population centers, and that has never provided a full and clear public accounting of what it built and what remains. The question of what is still active and what has been genuinely decommissioned is one that the Canadian government handles with the particular combination of mild boredom and careful opacity that it reserves for questions it considers inappropriate or premature. When journalists or researchers ask about the current status of specific Cold War facilities under access to information legislation, the responses they receive are uniformly bland and uniformly incomplete. This is not necessarily sinister. Governments maintain certain infrastructure in certain states for reasons that have more to do with institutional inertia than with actual operational planning. But the combination of significant Cold War underground construction, incomplete public disclosure, and the general tendency of governments to treat their subsurface infrastructure as categorically different from their above-ground infrastructure in terms of transparency and public accountability means that in Ottawa and several other Canadian cities, there is a layer of the underground that is not just physically buried, but administratively buried. Buried in bureaucratic language and incomplete records and the passage of time. 15 meters below the surface of the national capital, there are rooms that the Government of Canada does not discuss. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply a fact. And it sits alongside the archaeological facts and the buried river facts as part of the same broader pattern. The pattern in which the Canadian underground is treated as a kind of institutional zone of forgetting. A place where things are put when they are not meant to be found. In Alberta, the buried world takes a different form again. Edmonton and Calgary are young cities that grew explosively during the oil boom of the 20th century. Beneath both of them, the buried world is partly the buried world of Indigenous history, and partly the buried world of the energy industry. Alberta's geological column is extraordinarily rich in hydrocarbons. The province sits on sedimentary formations that were laid down over hundreds of millions of years by ancient seas and river systems. And within those formations, vast quantities of petroleum were accumulated. The infrastructure for extracting, processing, and transporting those hydrocarbons extends deep underground across the province. Alberta has thousands of kilometers of pipelines running beneath its ground surface. It has hundreds of abandoned and capped oil and gas wells, many of them drilled in the early and middle 20th century, before modern regulations required comprehensive decommissioning. It has underground storage facilities for natural gas and other petroleum products. The buried world of Alberta's energy infrastructure is not secret. It is documented and regulated and mapped by the Alberta Energy Regulator and other agencies. But it is also extensive enough and old enough in some of its components and complicated enough in its geology that the full picture of what is underground across the province has never been assembled in a single coherent document that any one person or agency could be said to fully possess. There are abandoned wells in Alberta whose casings may have corroded and whose current seal integrity is a matter of ongoing assessment rather than confirmed certainty. There are underground storage caverns created by dissolving out salt deposits with injected water, creating large cavities now holding natural gas under pressure, whose long-term geological stability is subject to continuing technical review. Beneath the surface normalcy of the Alberta landscape, below the farms and the suburbs and the highway corridors, there is a buried world of significant complexity, and in certain carefully specified locations, significant risk. And beneath that buried world of industrial infrastructure, at greater depth, there is the other buried world, the one that was there before any of this, before the pipelines and the wells and the cities. The world of the people who lived on these plains for 12,000 years. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump in the foothills west of Fort Macleod is perhaps the best known archaeological site in Alberta, a place where the Blackfoot and their predecessors drove herds of bison over a cliff edge in carefully organized communal hunts that took place over a period of approximately 6,000 years. The bones at the base of the cliff are piled up to 12 meters deep in some places. 12 meters of bison bone, representing 6,000 years of successful hunting, compressed into a deposit that archaeologists have spent decades investigating. Head Smashed In is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is protected, studied, and the subject of ongoing collaboration between archaeologists and the Blackfoot Confederacy. It is one of the places where the pre-contact past of Alberta has been made genuinely, substantively public. But Head Smashed In is not under a city. The sites that are under Edmonton and Calgary, the campsites and processing areas and winter quarters and burial grounds that preceded those cities by thousands of years, have received no such protection. They have been encountered, piecemeal, in the basements of new buildings and the trenches of utility installations, their material excavated hastily and incompletely, and then reburied under concrete and steel, their story added to the list of things that are known about but not discussed. In Ottawa itself, the question of what is underground is made particularly charged by the nature of the city and what it represents. The capital of Canada, the city that presents itself as the embodiment of the nation's history and identity, has, in its public historical consciousness, a relationship with the pre-contact past that is profoundly incomplete. The National War Memorial stands in the centre of the city and honours those who died in Canada's wars. The Parliament buildings present a narrative of confederation and responsible government and the growth of a democracy from colonial origins. The Canadian Museum of History, across the river in Gatineau, has a magnificent hall of First Peoples that presents the material culture of Indigenous civilizations in a way that is genuinely impressive and thoughtfully curated. But the specific archaeological record beneath the city itself, beneath Parliament Hill and the Byward Market and the older residential neighborhoods, that record is buried and unacknowledged in any systematic public way. The promontory above the Ottawa River, where the Parliament buildings now stand, was exactly the kind of elevated, river-facing terrain that would have attracted repeated occupation over millennia. High ground overlooking a major river, protected on several sides by ravines and watercourses, with access to the river below and to the forests and plains above. people would have used this location. No systematic excavation has ever been conducted on Parliament Hill to investigate whether they did. What is beneath the seat of Canadian government is something that nobody has fully looked at. And then there is Chaudière Falls. The Chaudière Falls is a series of rapids and cascades on the Ottawa River, just above the confluence with the Rideau River, in what is now the core of the city. The falls were not merely a geographical feature. They were one of the most spiritually significant places in the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, the Anishinaabe of the Ottawa Valley. The Algonquin people called the falls Astiku, meaning boiling water, and they held ceremonies there that went back into deep time. Ceremonies involving the offering of tobacco and prayer at the edge of the churning water. Ceremonies that marked the passage of canoe journeys along the river, the giving of thanks for safe passage through the rapids, the acknowledgement of the power of the place. These ceremonies were not trivial customs. They were expressions of a spiritual relationship with this particular piece of geography that had been maintained across many generations. Within a generation of the first sustained European contact, the Algonquin people who had maintained those ceremonies at Chaudière Falls were devastated by the epidemic diseases that preceded and accompanied European settlement. Their population collapsed, their political structures were disrupted, and their sacred relationship with the falls was interrupted in ways that have never fully been repaired. In the 19th century, the falls were harnessed for industrial power. Mills were built on the islands in the middle of the falls. The water that had been sacred became an energy source. And today, the islands are the site of a large mixed-use development project, one that has proceeded over the documented and sustained objections of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Beneath the construction now underway at Chaudière Falls, at the 15-meter depth and below, the archaeological record of the Algonquin presence at this place extends back thousands of years. Excavations associated with earlier development on the islands have turned up stone tools and other pre-contact material. The sediment of the river channels around the islands contains the material of millennia of human activity at this location. This place where people came to pray and to pause on their journeys and to give thanks to the river for its power. That sediment is being compressed and displaced by the new foundations being driven into the ground. And the ceremony that once happened here, that was interrupted by epidemic and displacement and colonial development, is still being asked for, still being requested by the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have not forgotten what this place was. In Quebec City, which is one of the oldest continuously inhabited European settlements in Canada, the underground is a particular challenge for anyone who needs to dig for any reason. The lower town of Quebec City sits at the base of the promontory that carries the upper town, built on landfill created from the debris of the cliff above and from the gradual reclamation of the shoreline of the St. Lawrence. In the lower town, the buried world includes the original shoreline, the wharves and warehouses of the earliest colonial port, and the accumulated material of 4 centuries of urban life piled on top of it. But it also includes something older, the site of Stadacona. Stadacona was an Iroquoian village that Cartier encountered during his second voyage to the St. Lawrence in 1535. It was located at the base of the Quebec promontory, near the mouth of the St. Charles River. When Champlain established his habitation at Quebec in 1608, Stadacona was already gone. The village had disappeared in the interval between Cartier's first visit and Champlain's arrival. Where the people went, what became of them in those 7 decades, is one of the major unanswered questions of early Canadian history. But the village itself, or at least its material remains, did not disappear with the people. It was built over. The area around the mouth of the St. Charles River, where Stadacona is believed to have stood, contains archaeological deposits associated with the Iroquoian occupation. As with Hochelaga in Montreal, these deposits are buried beneath centuries of European construction. As with Hochelaga, they have never been comprehensively excavated. And as with Hochelaga, the knowledge that they are there is not widely communicated to the general public. Canada has, beneath its major cities, the buried material remains of at least 3 major pre-contact Iroquoian villages: Hochelaga beneath Montreal, Théayagon beneath Toronto, and Stadacona beneath Quebec City. These are not obscure or marginal sites. They are the locations of the first recorded encounters between European explorers and the indigenous peoples of the St. Lawrence Valley. They are, in any reasonable assessment, among the most historically significant archaeological sites in the country. All 3 of them are buried under cities. None of them has been fully excavated. All of them are discussed in academic literature. None of them is meaningfully present in the public consciousness of the cities that have been built on top of them. There is a question that runs beneath everything we have been describing, and it is time to ask it directly. Why does Canada not talk about this? Other countries have made the buried layers of their cities into a source of national identity and public fascination. In Rome, the archaeological strata are on display at every turn. Ancient ruins emerge from the ground and are incorporated into the urban fabric as a matter of ordinary civic life. In Athens, the metro stations display the artifacts found during their construction, turning the underground infrastructure itself into a kind of distributed museum. In Mexico City, the remnants of Tenochtitlan are visible in the middle of the modern city, integrated into its squares and plazas in a way that acknowledges, with striking directness, the depth of the history on which the present is built. Canada does not, in general, do this. There are exceptions. The Pointe-Callière Museum in Montreal is a genuine attempt to make the archaeological layers of the city accessible to everyone who visits it. The Forks in Winnipeg acknowledges its deep history with more honesty than many comparable sites in any country. Some First Nations cultural centers provide access to aspects of the pre-contact record that the broader public is rarely exposed to. The Diefenbunker, in its transformation from active Cold War facility to public museum, has made one layer of the underground legible in a way that is both entertaining and thought-provoking. But these are islands in a landscape of relative indifference. The general tendency of Canadian cities is to treat their archaeological heritage as an obstacle to development, rather than as a resource to be incorporated into a sense of place. To treat the subsurface as a practical engineering challenge, rather than as a narrative archive. To regard what is found underground during construction as someone else's problem, rather than as everyone's inheritance. Part of this is genuinely practical. Cities are living systems. They cannot be frozen while archaeologists investigate every cubic meter of their subsurface. The tension between the requirements of development and the claims of heritage preservation is real and ongoing, and does not resolve neatly in either direction. Someone always has to decide what gets investigated and what gets built over. And those decisions involve trade-offs that are not always obvious or comfortable. But part of it is something else, something that is harder to name precisely, but that runs through the history of Canadian settlement like a thread you can feel but cannot quite see. The colonial project in Canada, as in other settler societies, required a particular kind of not knowing. Not a total forgetting, not the deliberate destruction of all evidence of prior occupation, but a sustained and practiced way of not asking certain questions. of not looking too closely at what was already here, of treating the land as available rather than as occupied. To settle land, it is useful to believe that the land was empty, or at least to maintain the social and institutional arrangements that allow you to act as though it were, without directly confronting the evidence that it was not. The buried world beneath Canadian cities is, in part, a literal expression of this figurative not knowing. The evidence of prior occupation was not destroyed. It was simply covered up, built over, pushed down into the substrate, below the level of daily life and daily attention, accessible in principle, but absent in practice from the awareness of the people who live above it. What lies at 15 meters below the streets of Canada's cities is not just artifacts and buried rivers in Cold War bunkers and the compressed remnants of old shorelines. It is also the material record of a question that Canadian society has been not quite asking for as long as it has been a society. The question of what it means to build a country in a place that was already fully occupied. What obligations arise from that act of building? What is owed to the people who were here before? What the relationship should be between the Canada that exists above ground and the Canada that is buried 15 meters below it. There is a shift happening, and it deserves acknowledgement. The relationship between Canadian cities and their buried pasts is changing. Slowly, and not without conflict, but genuinely. The change is driven by several forces that are converging. The first force is the strengthening of Indigenous legal and political rights. Over the past 3 decades, a series of Supreme Court decisions and legislative changes have significantly altered the relationship between Indigenous communities and the Canadian state with respect to land use and archaeological heritage. The duty to consult, established and clarified in law, means that development projects require a different kind of engagement with the communities whose ancestral territory and cultural heritage may be affected. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, published in 2015, include specific recommendations related to the protection and commemoration of Indigenous archaeological sites. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada formally adopted in 2016, establishes principles related to cultural heritage that are gradually being reflected in Canadian policy and practice. None of this has resolved the tensions between development timelines and heritage preservation requirements, but it has changed the terms of the conversation in ways that are sometimes frustratingly incremental, but that are nonetheless real. The second force is technological. The science of archaeology has advanced significantly in ways that make it possible to investigate buried sites with far less physical disturbance than was previously required. Ground-penetrating radar can map the subsurface architecture of a buried site without any digging at all. Soil chemistry analysis can identify the residues of human activity, the phosphates and lipids left behind by fires and food preparation and human occupation, without removing material from its original context. LiDAR imaging from aircraft can reveal features in the landscape that are entirely invisible to the naked eye on the ground. These technologies mean that the buried worlds beneath Canadian cities can be studied with increasing sophistication, even when excavation is not possible. They mean that the presence of archaeological material in a given location can be established before construction begins, rather than only when construction has already disturbed it. They change the nature of the conversation between developers and heritage authorities, from a reactive response to an unexpected discovery to a proactive understanding of what is there before anyone starts to dig. And the third force is the one that is perhaps the least dramatic, but the most pervasive. It is simply the passage of time and the constant churning process of urban development. Cities are not static. They are constantly being rebuilt. Every time a building is demolished and its replacement excavated, the ground is disturbed. Every time a utility main is replaced or a new line extended, a trench is opened. Every time a subway is bored through the earth, it passes through strata that may not have been disturbed since they were first deposited thousands of years ago. The constant process of urban change creates, continuously, windows into the buried world. And each window, however small and however briefly open, adds something to the accumulating picture of what is down there. In Toronto, the ongoing construction of the Ontario Line subway project, an ambitious 15-station line that will pass under a swath of the city that has never had rapid transit, is generating archaeological monitoring work across multiple sites. The reports from that monitoring will add to what is known about the pre-contact and early contact history of the city. In Montreal, the REM light rail network has involved extensive underground work in several neighborhoods, and the archaeological requirements attached to that work have produced new material and new documentation. In Vancouver, every significant development project in the city's core now comes with an archaeological assessment requirement that reflects the strength of the three host nations' engagement with the planning process. All of this material is being collected, documented, and placed in storage and in archives. The full story it tells, the complete picture of what the ground beneath Canadian cities contains across the full depth of their buried histories, is being assembled fragment by fragment. But the assembly is slow, and the distance between what specialists know and what the general public understands remains very large. The reports sit in archives. The artifacts sit in storage. The story waits. Let us return, one last time, to the depth. 15 meters. 15 meters below Montreal, the Mohawk village of Hochelaga is pressed into the soil of the McGill campus, its longhouses reduced to charcoal stains and the ghost circles of post holes in dark earth, its household goods compressed and fragmented and waiting in the quiet. 15 meters below Toronto, the buried tributaries of the Don and Humber River systems still flow. Constrained in their brick culverts, reduced in their volume, but present, still moving, still carrying their water to the lake in the dark, as they have done for 10,000 years. 15 meters below Winnipeg, the hearths of 6,000 years of human gathering are compressed into a layer of carbon and bone and shell beneath the market stalls of the Forks, where on a Saturday morning in winter, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifts across a skating trail, and children fall, and get up again, and fall again, in the particular joy of a cold prairie day. 15 meters below Vancouver, the shell middens of thousands of years of coastal life are sealed under the fill that was used to reclaim the tidal flats of False Creek. The shells of millions of clams and mussels, each one a small record of a meal, a day, a life, compressed into a stratum that has not seen light since the city was built over it. 15 meters below Ottawa, in a facility that is now a museum, but that was once designed with absolute seriousness as a site of governmental survival, there are rooms that were built for a catastrophe that never came. Rooms with bunks and desks and a radio room and a vault for the most important documents of the Canadian state. Rooms that were sealed and maintained and never used for their intended purpose, and that are now open to the public on weekends for the price of a museum ticket. And 15 meters below all of it, below the cities and the watercourses and the bunkers and the buried villages and the sealed archaeological layers, There is the earth itself. The Canadian Shield in the east, granite so old that its formation predates the evolution of complex life on this planet. The sedimentary plains in the center of the country, laid down by ancient seas whose chemistry is locked into the stone in layers that energy companies read like a book. The Pacific formations in the west, still moving, the geology of the continent still not finished with its own story. We have been here for a moment, all of us. The cities and the suburbs and the roads and the pipelines and the buried rivers and the Cold War bunkers and the ancient villages and the archaeological deposits and the geological formations below them. All of it is a moment in the time scale of the earth. But in the time scale of human experience, 15 meters is an eternity. It is the distance between what we know and what we have learned to stop looking for. Between the stories we tell about ourselves in the present tense and the stories that the ground tells about everyone who came before. The buried worlds beneath Canadian cities are not secrets in the conspiratorial sense. They are not classified or deliberately hidden or protected by government order. They are simply buried. And the fact of their burial, the fact that so much of what Canada was and is and has been is compacted into the ground beneath its present, is itself a story. A story about what a society chooses to excavate and what it chooses to build over. About what gets brought to light and what gets sealed below. About the layers of history that accumulate when you build a country very quickly on top of a world that was already here. Every city has these depths. Every city is a kind of archive, a vertical record of everything that has happened here, and everything that happened before that, and before that. Most of the time, we walk across the surface of this archive without reading it. We go about our days, buy our groceries, take our children to school, stand on platforms waiting for trains, and the world below is as remote as another country. But it is not another country. It is here. It is underneath you. It is 15 meters down. And if you could somehow descend to it, if you could open a hatch in the pavement and descend through the layers of urban time, you would find yourself in the company of everything that has ever happened in this place. Every fire that was lit here, every meal that was eaten, every building that was built and fell and was built again, every waterway that ran through here before anyone thought to divert it, every person who stopped at this location, for whatever reason, on their way through a world that is now as thoroughly buried as anything in the ground. This is not a comfortable story to sit with. It carries obligations that are easier to avoid when the evidence of them is underground, out of sight, accessible only to specialists who publish in journals that most people will never read. But the evidence is there. It is real. It is preserved in the particular way that dark, wet Canadian soil preserves things, with a fidelity that is sometimes astonishing. The ground has been keeping this record faithfully, without anyone asking it to, keeping it through the construction of cities above it, and the passage of centuries, and the accumulation of all the indifference and all the forgetting that have been piled on top of it. The buried world of Canada is patient. It has been patient for 10,000 years. It is still there. All of it. 15 meters below every city that was ever built on this particular stretch of the planet. 15 meters below where you are sitting right now, if you are sitting in one of these cities. If you are reading this in one of the places we have described. Still there, in the dark, still waiting to be found. The buried world beneath Canadian cities spans more than 10,000 years. Less than 3% of it has been systematically excavated. The Hochelaga village beneath McGill University in Montreal has never been fully investigated. The original site of Stadacona beneath Quebec City has never been fully investigated. The pre-contact deposits beneath Vancouver's False Creek continue to be disturbed by development. The Diefenbunker in Carp, Ontario is now a museum open to the public. Not everything that was built underground at that time has been publicly accounted for. The buried rivers of Toronto still flow. The midden beneath Marpole in Vancouver is still there. The 6,000-year hearths beneath the Forks in Winnipeg are still there. The sacred sediment around the Chaudière Falls in Ottawa is still there. All of it is still there. 15 meters down. Expanded sections. Additional depth. There is a city on the Atlantic coast that rarely enters conversations about Canadian archaeological heritage, and this absence is itself a kind of statement. Halifax, Nova Scotia, was established as a British colonial settlement in 1749, one of the largest single military operations of colonial organization in North American history when it took place. More than 2,500 settlers arrived in a single convoy of ships and were set to work building a fortified town on the western shore of one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic seaboard. The speed and scale of Halifax's founding is part of what makes its buried world so significant and so imperfectly understood. The site that was chosen for the settlement was not empty. It was the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, the Lanoo, whose communities had lived throughout what is now Nova Scotia and the surrounding region for at least 11,000 years. They had been in contact with Europeans for over 2 centuries before the founding of Halifax, first with Basque fishermen and then with French colonists, and the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and the European presence on their territory had been complex and often violent. But the territory itself was Mi'kmaq territory, and the harbor where the British built their town had been a place of Mi'kmaq activity, fishing and gathering and travel, for as long as people had been on this coast. Beneath the streets of downtown Halifax, below the historic properties district and the old town clock, and the citadel that still sits on the hill above the harbor, there are archaeological deposits that have never been comprehensively investigated. The harbor shore, where the earliest settlers built their wharves and warehouses, was a place of intensive pre-contact use. The shallow tidal waters of the harbor were rich in shellfish. The streams that ran down from the Citadel Hill drained a productive hinterland. People would have been drawn to this spot for a very long time before anyone thought to build a fortress here. Excavations associated with various development projects in the downtown core over the decades have turned up occasional pre-contact material. Stone tools, ceramic fragments, the traces of fires and food preparation. Each find is documented, placed in context, and then reburied or removed to storage. The cumulative picture they provide of a harbor shore that was an important place in the Mi'kmaq world for thousands of years before it became a British military installation is known to archaeologists and heritage professionals, but is essentially invisible to the general public. Halifax also has its own buried rivers. The freshwater brook, which once ran openly through the north end of the city, was enclosed in a culvert in the 19th century and is now completely underground. The streams that drained from the Citadel Hill into the harbor were diverted and buried as the city grew. And like the buried rivers of Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, these streams carry in their sealed sediment the evidence of everything that happened on their banks across thousands of years of human occupation. There is also, beneath Halifax, a different kind of buried history. The city sits above an extraordinarily complex network of former defensive works, the earthworks and tunnels and magazines and underground chambers that were associated with the citadel and its predecessor fortifications. These underground military works were dug across a period of 2 centuries, modified and extended and partially demolished and partially preserved, in layers that reflect the changing nature of military technology and strategic thinking. Some of them are documented and maintained as heritage features. Others have been sealed off and forgotten, their locations known in principle, but their condition uncertain. The citadel itself, the current star-shaped fortress that sits on the hill above the downtown, sits on top of a much older series of fortifications, going back to the 1750s. Each phase of the fortification required significant earthworks, and those earthworks buried the evidence of what came before. Beneath the current citadel, there are the earthworks of the earlier forts, and beneath those, at greater depth, there are the archaeological deposits associated with the Mi'kmaq occupation of the hill and its surrounding landscape. That is the characteristic layering of Halifax's buried world. Colonial military infrastructure built on top of older colonial military infrastructure, built on top of the buried evidence of 11,000 years of Mi'kmaq life on this land. Each layer sealing the ones below. Each layer carrying its own history and its own significance. And the whole stack pressed down by the weight of a city that has been continuously inhabited for nearly 3 centuries and has given very little sustained public attention to what is under it. Let us travel to the other coast, to Victoria on Vancouver Island, the provincial capital of British Columbia. Victoria is, in many ways, the most English city in Canada, and it has cultivated this identity with a thoroughness that is both charming and somewhat ahistorical. The hanging flower baskets and the double-decker bus tours and the afternoon tea service at the Empress Hotel create an atmosphere of transplanted Englishness that can feel entirely convincing on a summer afternoon. But Victoria sits on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, which is the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And the archaeological record of that territory extends back at least 10,000 years. The inner harbor, where the Empress Hotel sits and where the tourist boats tie up, was once one of the most productive shellfish beds on the entire coast. The Lekwungen people harvested those shellfish for generations beyond counting. The middens they created in doing so were, before the city was built, among the largest on the island. When James Douglas established Fort Victoria for the Hudson's Bay Company in 1843, he chose the site partly because of the natural advantages of the harbor, and partly because of the fertile land around it. That land had not been maintained by nature alone. The grasslands and the open park-like areas around the fort were, in part, the product of thousands of years of deliberate management by the Lekwungen people, who used controlled burning and other practices to create and maintain the kind of open, productive landscape that European observers sometimes mistook for pristine wilderness. The city that grew up around the fort, incorporated in 1862, was built directly on top of this managed and inhabited landscape. The middens were used as fill material for low-lying areas. The grasslands were broken up and planted with gardens and orchards, and eventually streets. And the archaeological record of the Lekwungen occupation was buried under what became the capital city of the new province of British Columbia. Beneath the streets of downtown Victoria, below the tourist district and the government buildings and the old residential neighborhoods, there are archaeological deposits of considerable age and significance. Systematic investigation of these deposits has been limited by the constraints that apply everywhere: the difficulty of excavating in a living city, the competition between development timelines and heritage requirements, the gaps in funding and political will. But what has been investigated suggests that the Victoria area contains a pre-contact archaeological record as rich and as deep as anything on the coast. The relationship between the city of Victoria and the Songhees and Esquimalt nations has been complicated by history. The land on which the city was built was transferred to the Crown through a series of treaties negotiated by James Douglas in the early 1850s, the Douglas Treaties, which remain the only treaties covering the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the area now occupied by Victoria. The terms of those treaties, their interpretation, and the degree to which they adequately protected the interests of the Lekwungen people have been subjects of ongoing legal and political discussion. What lies beneath the city is relevant to that discussion. The archaeological record is evidence of the depth and continuity of the Lekwungen presence on this land. It is evidence that this was not empty territory when the fort was built. It is evidence that a sophisticated and long-established community had been managing and inhabiting this landscape for a very long time before anyone arrived to claim it for the Crown. That evidence is underground, in the dark, under the hanging flower baskets and the afternoon tea service, and all the accumulated apparatus of a city that has largely chosen to present itself as though its history began in 1843. The prairies of Saskatchewan contain some of the most significant pre-contact archaeological sites in Canada, and two of the province's cities, Saskatoon and Regina, sit in landscapes that have been inhabited by human beings for as long as the prairies have been habitable. Saskatoon is located on the South Saskatchewan River, at a point where the river cuts through the prairie plain in a broad valley that provided shelter, water, and the kind of productive riverside habitat that has attracted human habitation in every continent and in every period of human history. People have been stopping at this bend in the river for approximately 11,000 years. The archaeological record of the Saskatoon area includes evidence of bison hunting camps, seasonal gathering sites, and places of ceremonial significance that predate the city by an extraordinary margin. When the city was settled by temperance colonists from Ontario in 1882, the land along the river was understood, from a colonial perspective, as available for settlement. From the perspective of the Cree and Assiniboine and Nakota peoples, whose traditional territory this was, it was anything but available. The numbered treaty process that covered this region, Treaty 6, had been signed in 1876, but its terms and their implications were understood very differently by the Crown and by the First Nations who signed it. And those different understandings continue to generate legal and political conflict to the present day. Beneath the streets of Saskatoon, below the university and the downtown, and the residential neighborhoods that spread along both sides of the river, there is an archaeological record that has been imperfectly and incompletely investigated. The deep alluvial deposits of the river valley, laid down over thousands of years of flooding and deposition, contain artifacts and features dating back to the post-glacial period. Excavations along the river valley associated with various development projects over the decades have produced material that adds to the understanding of pre-contact occupation in the area. But the systematic investigation of what lies beneath Saskatoon has never been adequately funded or comprehensively conducted. The reports that exist are piecemeal. The picture they provide is fragmentary, and the public awareness of the depth of human history in this part of the continent, in a city that has been in existence for less than 150 years, is essentially non-existent. Regina, the provincial capital, sits not on a river, but on a small lake that was originally called Wascana, a Cree word meaning pile of bones, referring to the bison bones that accumulated here over centuries of hunting. The name alone tells you something about what this place was before the city arrived. It was a place where bison were killed and processed, where the bones accumulated in quantities great enough to give the location its name. The Wascana Lake that exists today in the middle of Regina is an artificial lake, its water level regulated by a dam, its shores manicured into a parkland that hosts the provincial legislative building and a science museum and a large urban park. The original Wascana Creek, from which the lake was created, was a modest prairie waterway, unremarkable in appearance, extraordinary in its archaeological significance. Beneath the parkland and the lake and the institutional buildings that surround it, the sediment of Wascana Creek contains the accumulated evidence of thousands of years of human activity at this place. The bison hunters, whose processed kills gave the location its name, left behind bone deposits and tool scatters and fire features that are, in some places, deeply buried and well preserved. The people who came here in later periods, the Cree and the Assiniboine, whose descendants are the First Nations communities of contemporary Saskatchewan, left their own layers of material in the sediment. None of this is comprehensively documented. Some of it has been encountered during construction projects in the area. All of it remains largely unknown to the residents of Regina, who live their daily lives above it without any real awareness that the city they inhabit was built in a place that people had been coming to for thousands of years before the first survey stake was driven. The question of how this situation came to be, and what it means that so much of what lies beneath Canadian cities is so poorly known to the people who live above it, leads to a set of legal and institutional observations that are worth making. Canada has heritage legislation at both the federal and provincial levels that is intended to protect archaeological sites and human remains found during development projects. The Federal Impact Assessment Act, the Provincial Heritage Acts of each province, and various pieces of enabling legislation provide a framework for identifying, assessing, documenting, and in some cases, preserving the archaeological heritage that is encountered during construction. In practice, the effectiveness of this framework varies considerably from province to province and from project to project. Ontario has relatively robust archaeology requirements, including a system of licensed archaeologists and mandatory pre-construction assessment for many types of development. British Columbia has strengthened its heritage provisions significantly in recent decades, partly in response to the growing political and legal strength of First Nations in the province. Quebec has a Heritage Act that provides for archaeological assessment, and that has produced, through the Pointe-à-Callière Museum and other institutions, a degree of public engagement with urban archaeology that is arguably the strongest in Canada. But, in all provinces, the fundamental tension between development timelines and heritage requirements is managed in ways that consistently prioritize development. The default assumption in the Canadian Heritage Assessment System is that development will proceed, and that archaeology will be accommodated within the development timeline, rather than the other way around. This means that when significant material is found, the response is almost always salvage. The rapid documentation of as much as possible within the time available, rather than the kind of systematic investigation that the material might deserve. The problem is compounded by chronic underfunding of archaeological research at universities and heritage institutions across the country. The number of professional archaeologists in Canada is small, relative to the archaeological resource base that the country possesses. The storage facilities for archaeological collections are, in many cases, overwhelmed by the volume of material they have been asked to hold. The backlogs of unanalyzed material from past excavations are, in many institutions, staggering. Reports sit unprocessed. Artifacts sit in boxes. The knowledge that could be extracted from this material waits, year after year, for funding and time and staff that are not available. This is not a conspiracy. It is a systems problem, a problem of priorities and resources, and the way that heritage is valued relative to other things in a society that is, for entirely understandable reasons, more focused on its present and its future than on its past. But it has real consequences. It means that the buried worlds beneath Canadian cities are not merely buried in the physical sense. They are also buried in the institutional and financial sense, pressed down under the weight of underfunded heritage systems and unprocessed collections, and a public discourse that has never quite found the language to make this matter in the way that it should. There are people working to change this. They are archaeologists and indigenous community members and heritage advocates and journalists and educators and museum professionals and urban planners. They are working with the tools available to them, some of which are much better than they used to be, others of which remain frustratingly limited. They are adding, fragment by fragment, to the picture of what is down there. And occasionally, something happens that brings the buried world briefly to the surface in a way that catches public attention. In 2016, during construction work for a new condominium development in the distillery district of Toronto, workers encountered what appeared to be the remains of a wooden structure at approximately 4 meters below the current street level. Work stopped. Archaeologists were called. The structure turned out to be the remains of a late 18th century building associated with the Gooderham and Worts distillery, which had operated on the site from the 1830s onward, and whose surviving structures now form the heritage core of the distillery district neighborhood. The discovery made the news briefly and was incorporated into the narrative of the development project. The developer was enthusiastic about the historical resonance of the find, which added to the heritage credentials of a neighborhood that is explicitly marketed on the basis of its historical character. But below that late 18th century structure, at greater depth, in the sediment of the Don River Delta on whose edge the distillery had been built, there were older deposits containing pre-contact material, archaeological material from the period before the distillery, before the city, before European contact. That material received considerably less media attention than the colonial-era structure above it. This is the characteristic pattern. The recent past is interesting. The distant past, the past that is truly ancient, the past that requires a different framework for understanding because it belongs to a world that predates the entire conceptual apparatus of the Canadian state. That past is less accessible. It requires more explanation. It demands more from the people who encounter it, more willingness to sit with complexity, more comfort with the kind of deep time that makes the entire history of European settlement on this continent look like a very thin surface layer over something much larger and much longer and much richer. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the buried worlds beneath Canadian cities is this. They are evidence of duration. They are evidence that this land has been home to human beings for a very long time, and that those human beings built lives and communities and knowledge systems and spiritual practices and relationships with the land that were sophisticated and meaningful and worthy of the same kind of respect that any culture deserves. They are also evidence of interruption, of a long continuity that was disrupted, in different ways and at different speeds in different places, by the arrival of European settlement, of communities that were displaced and dispersed and sometimes destroyed, and whose displacement made room for the cities that now sit above their buried remains. And they are evidence of persistence. because the people whose ancestors are in that buried sediment are still here. The Mississaugas of the Credit, the Musqueam, the Mi'kmaq, the Algonquin Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lekwungen, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and all the other nations whose traditional territories contain the cities we have been describing. They are still here. Their communities persist. Their languages are being revitalized. Their legal claims are being argued in courts that are, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to acknowledge their legitimacy. The buried world is not only a record of what was lost, it is also a record of what remains, of a presence in this land that predates the cities by an enormous margin, and that will, in one form or another, outlast them. That is not a romantic statement. It is a historical observation. The deep time below Canadian cities goes back 12,000 years. The cities themselves are, at most, 300 years old. The cities are the recent development. Everything below them is the context in which the cities exist. Understanding that context, taking it seriously as a part of what Canada is and what it means to live here, is not merely an archaeological project or a heritage project. It is a project of understanding, of knowing where you are and what it means to be here, of reading the full archive, not just the most recent pages. The full archive is 15 meters down, in every Canadian city, in the quiet and the dark, waiting to be read. There is one more thing worth saying. When archaeologists work at depth in Canadian cities, when they have the time and the resources and the appropriate collaboration with Indigenous communities to do the work carefully and well, what they sometimes find is not just material evidence of past human activity. They find evidence of relationship, evidence of people's relationship with the land, with the water, with the other species that shared the landscape with them. The bison bones at the forks tell a story, not just about what people ate, but about how they organized themselves, how they coordinated large communal hunts, how they processed and stored the products of those hunts, how they shared the results across communities. The shell middens of the Pacific coast are not just kitchen waste. They are records of an intimate and sophisticated knowledge of the tidal zone, of the seasons, of the behavior of the species that lived there, accumulated across thousands of years of careful observation. The charcoal traces in the sediment beneath Toronto tell a story of fires lit at the same places over and over again, generation after generation, because those were good places to stop, good places to camp, good places to rest beside the river before continuing north or south on the journey through this landscape. The continuity of those fire sites, visible in the stratigraphy as layers of charcoal separated by thin bands of clean sediment, is evidence of knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge of a landscape that was home. That knowledge is one of the things that was disrupted by colonization, not destroyed, not in the communities that survived, but disrupted, changed, forced underground in a metaphorical sense that mirrors the physical burial of the material evidence in the literal underground below the cities. The work of cultural revitalization that many Indigenous communities are engaged in, the reclaiming of languages and ceremonies and relationships with the land, is related to the work of understanding what is underground. Both are about recovering something that was buried. Both are about reading the full archive instead of only the recent pages. And both are, in their own ways, acts of patience. The ground has been patient for 12,000 years. The communities whose ancestors made that ground have been patient through 300 years of disruption and displacement. The archaeologists, who work carefully and slowly in difficult conditions, recovering fragments of evidence and assembling them into pictures of lives lived long ago, have been patient through underfunding and underappreciation and the constant pressure of development timelines. This is a story that rewards patience, that requires it. The buried world beneath Canadian cities is not going anywhere. It will be there tomorrow and next year and in a century. The question is whether the society that lives above it will, in that time, develop the curiosity and the commitment and the political will to understand what it holds. 15 meters down, all of it, waiting. Final expansion, specific discoveries, and the meaning of depth. In the spring of 1954, workers excavating a new housing development in the east end of Montreal made a discovery that briefly interrupted the work and was then largely forgotten. They were digging foundation trenches in the neighbourhood of Pointe-aux-Trembles, east of the island's industrial core, when one of the trenches broke through into a layer of dark, organically rich soil at a depth of approximately 4 meters. In that layer were artifacts. Stone tools of the kind that archaeologists associate with the Archaic period, a cultural phase dating roughly from 8,000 to 3,000 years before present. Scrapers and knives and the flaking debris from tool manufacture, concentrated in a pattern that suggested this had been a workshop, a place where people sat and made the tools they needed from the raw materials they had gathered from the riverbed. The find was reported. An archaeologist came out from McGill and spent 2 days at the site. Notes were taken, some of the artifacts were collected, and then the foundation trenches were filled and the houses were built, and the site was covered over, and the notes sat in a file cabinet in a university office for decades, retrieved occasionally by graduate students doing literature reviews, never incorporated into any public account of the history of the island. This is not a particularly dramatic story. It is not the kind of thing that makes headlines. But it is typical of the way that the buried world of Canadian cities has been encountered and handled across most of the 20th century. Find, note, cover, move on. What changed, and what is still in the process of changing, is the attitude toward these encounters. The shift from treating the buried world as an inconvenient obstacle to treating it as a resource of genuine and serious value. That shift is cultural and institutional and legal all at once, and it is happening at different speeds in different parts of the country. In British Columbia, the shift has been driven substantially by the outcomes of a series of landmark legal cases that have affirmed and strengthened Indigenous title and rights in ways that have direct implications for what happens when the buried world is encountered. The Delgamuukw case, decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997, affirmed that Indigenous title had not been extinguished in British Columbia, and established that Indigenous peoples had a right to use the land in ways that included the protection of archaeological and cultural sites. Subsequent cases have built on that foundation, and the practical result is that archaeological assessment and Indigenous consultation are now robust requirements for development projects in British Columbia, in a way that they are not, at least not to the same degree, in every province. In Ontario, the regulatory framework for archaeology has been shaped by the province's Heritage Act and by a series of policy documents that require archaeological assessment as part of the planning process for development in areas of archaeological potential. The definition of archaeological potential is relatively broad, and the result is that a significant volume of archaeological assessment work is conducted in Ontario every year. Most of this work is carried out by private sector consulting archaeologists, firms that are licensed to conduct the assessments and that are hired by developers to satisfy the regulatory requirement. This is an interesting model. It means that the archaeological investigation of the buried world is driven by the development process rather than by academic curiosity or heritage values. The archaeologist is there because the developer has to pay for an assessment, not because the heritage community has decided that a site is important enough to investigate. The result is a vast volume of assessment work, much of it of high quality, that documents the buried world of Ontario in incremental and fragmented ways. The full picture that this accumulated documentation provides, if anyone were to assemble it comprehensively, would be remarkable. Thousands of individual site assessments, each one adding a small piece to the mosaic of pre-contact and historic period occupation across the province. Taken together, they constitute the most detailed record of the archaeological landscape of any part of Canada. But they are not compiled in any single accessible place. They sit in a provincial registry of archaeological reports that is accessible to licensed archaeologists, but is not easily navigable by the general public. The mosaic exists in principle. It has never been fully assembled in practice. There is a quality to the buried world of Canadian cities that deserves more attention than it usually receives, and that is the quality of preservation. The conditions that seal archaeological material underground are, in many cases, remarkably favorable to the long-term preservation of organic material that would not survive in open-air conditions. The waterlogged anaerobic sediments of buried river channels and former shorelines can preserve wood and leather and textile and bone for thousands of years. The dry, chemically stable conditions of certain underground chambers can preserve paper and organic material with extraordinary fidelity. The compacted earth beneath urban streets, sealed from the surface by layers of pavement and fill, maintains a stable temperature and moisture environment that slows the processes of decay. This means that when archaeologists do reach the buried world of a Canadian city, they sometimes find things that are startlingly well preserved. Wooden structures, leather goods, plant material, the contents of storage pits, objects that would have disintegrated on the surface within decades survive underground for centuries or millennia, waiting with a patience that is, when you think about it, one of the most remarkable properties of the earth. The 1992 discovery of the 17th century cemetery in the Vieux Port of Montreal produced skeletal material that was well enough preserved to allow detailed paleopathological analysis. The bones of the earliest French colonists told stories about their diets, their diseases, the injuries they suffered, the parasites they carried. The cemetery had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, and the earth had kept its contents in a condition that allowed them to speak. The same principle applies to the far older deposits at the 15-meter depth and below. In waterlogged conditions, the wooden posts of a longhouse built 2,000 years ago can still retain their shape and their grain and something of their original character. The charcoal from a fire lit 5,000 years ago can still be radiocarbon dated with considerable precision. The seeds and plant remains in a food storage pit sealed 4,000 years ago can still be identified and analyzed and can tell us what people were eating and growing and collecting in that place at that time. The buried world is not only a record of the past in the abstract sense. It is a physical record, a material archive, full of objects and substances that carry information encoded in their chemistry and their structure and their spatial relationships to each other. Information that is waiting to be read by the analytical techniques that archaeologists and other scientists bring to the task. The tragedy, if that is the right word for a situation that is more complex than any single word can capture, is that so much of this archive is being disturbed and sealed and lost before it can be properly read. The development process that drives most archaeological investigation in Canadian cities is not designed to serve the interests of the archive. It is designed to serve the interests of the development, and those interests are almost always in tension with the slower, more expensive, more disruptive process of doing justice to what the ground contains. This tension will not be resolved easily or quickly. Cities need to grow and change and build. Archaeological sites need time and care and resources that are often not available. The negotiation between these competing needs is ongoing, and it does not have a simple solution. But it is worth knowing that the tension exists. Worth knowing that every time a new building goes up in a Canadian city, there is a buried world being sealed beneath it. Worth knowing that the ground under your feet is not empty, has never been empty, and contains a record of human presence on this continent that stretches back to the very beginning of human life in the northern latitudes. Worth knowing, and worth caring about, even a little, even from a distance, even from the surface. The night sky above Canadian cities is obscured by light pollution. You cannot see the stars the way people once saw them before the cities were built. The stars are still there, of course. They have not gone anywhere. They are exactly where they were when the people who lit those fires at the 15-meter depth tilted their heads back on clear winter nights and saw the Milky Way spread from horizon to horizon without a building or a streetlight in the way. The buried world is something like those stars, obscured by what has been built above it, present but invisible from the surface, requiring an effort, a deliberate act of attention to know that it is there. The stars are still there. The buried world is still there. Both of them require us to look past what is immediately visible in order to see them. That is, in the end, what this story is asking for. Not for the cities to be torn down, not for development to stop, not for any dramatic or impractical act of historical reckoning. Just the looking. Just the willingness to know that the ground beneath your feet has a depth that the surface does not reveal. That the city you live in is built on top of another city, and another, and another, going back to the very beginning of human time in this part of the world. That those other cities are still there, 15 meters down, in the dark, in the quiet, still there, still waiting. There is a specific kind of silence that exists underground. Anyone who has spent time in caves or in the basements of old buildings, or in the rare cases where it has been possible to walk the tunnels that run beneath Canadian cities, will know what this silence is. It is not the absence of sound. It is a different quality of sound, a dampening, a softening, a removal of the ambient frequencies that fill the surface world. The traffic and the wind and the voices and the machinery of daily life are gone. What remains is a quiet so complete that it almost has a physical presence. That is the quality of silence that surrounds the buried world of Canadian cities. Not the silence of nothing. The silence of something that is not making noise because it does not need to, because it is not going anywhere, because it has all the time in the world. The Mi'kmaq oral traditions of Nova Scotia contain accounts of the land that describe, in language that has been passed down through many generations, the character of specific places, the quality of the light at certain times of year, the way particular rivers sound in spring flood, the locations where specific plants grow, and the uses to which they can be put. This knowledge is not merely environmental. It is historical, in the deepest sense of that word. It is knowledge of how things have been in specific places across a span of time that dwarfs the written record of European settlement on this continent. That knowledge lives in the people who carry it, and it corresponds, in ways that archaeologists are increasingly recognizing and engaging with, to the material record buried in the ground. The places that oral tradition describes as significant are, very often, the places where the most concentrated archaeological evidence of human activity is found. The places where people gathered and returned across generations are the places that both the oral tradition and the buried sediment remember. This is one of the most compelling arguments for taking the buried world seriously, not just as an archaeological resource, not just as a heritage asset, but as a form of knowledge that belongs to the people whose ancestors created it, and that can, when treated with appropriate respect and care, provide a kind of understanding of the Canadian landscape that no other source can offer. The buried world is a library, an archive, written in charcoal and bone and stone and shell, and the dark soil of riverbeds and the compacted sediment of ancient shorelines, in the organic chemistry of fires that burned thousands of years ago and left their carbon in the ground as a permanent record of their existence. Most of that library has never been read. Most of it is still being written, as the accumulating reports of archaeological assessments and monitoring programs add new entries to the catalog of what is known. And all of it, in the broadest sense, belongs not to the archaeologists who investigate it, or the developers whose projects uncover it, but to the communities whose ancestors created it. That is the most important thing to understand about the buried world beneath Canadian cities. It is not ownerless. It is not available for whoever happens to dig it up. It is the material expression of the lives of specific peoples whose descendants are still present, still living in and near the cities that were built above their ancestral landscape, still maintaining their claims to a relationship with this land that is far older and far deeper than anything the cities above represent. 15 meters down, 10,000 years of depth, all of it present, all of it real. The surface of Canada is young. The ground beneath it is ancient. And in that ancient ground, compressed and preserved and waiting in the particular quiet of the underground, is the evidence of everything this land was before it became what it is now. That evidence is not going to disappear. It is going to be found, fragment by fragment, report by report, excavation by excavation, in the coming decades and centuries. The question is not whether it will eventually be understood. The question is, who will be involved in that understanding, and what will be done with what is learned? The answer to that question matters. It matters to the descendants of the people whose lives are recorded in that buried sediment. It matters to the cities that were built above it, and to the people who live in those cities. And it matters to the broader question of what Canada understands itself to be, what history it claims, what depth it is willing to acknowledge beneath the surface it presents to the world. 15 meters, every city, everywhere, all of it still there, in the quiet, in the dark, in the deep, still ground beneath everything you can see.